during the campaigns. So here's some of the promises we've heard over the last few months.
Well, there's a couple of agencies up there that I tell you have got to go. I said the first one would be the Department of Energy.
If we can do what I have proposed, which is get rid of the Department of Education.
Let's not tax corporations.
Let's keep taxes low and let's cut spending.
I think the solution is to eliminate corporate taxes altogether.
Get the EPA out of our coal business down here, get OSHA out of our small businesses.
I think all we should do is issue subpoenas and have one hearing after another and expose all the nonsense that has gone on.
That was Michelle Bachman talking about subpoenas, but her biggest issues have been cutting taxes, cutting the deficit, and cutting spending. Again, she hasn't been very specific, so we figured let's start tonight. In President Obama's proposed $3.8 trillion budget next year, if you take defense, Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, interest on the debt, unemployment insurance, food stamps, and federal pensions off the table, there's only about 15% chunk left over to actually make cuts to. And cutting from just that 15% of the pie will not save enough money to really make a serious dent in the more than $1 trillion deficit. So, keep them honest, we wanted to know what specifically would Congresswoman Bachman cut now that her party controls the House. I talked to her earlier. Again, she hasn't been very specific, so we figured let's start tonight. In President Obama's proposed $3.8 trillion budget next year, if you take defense, Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, interest on the debt, unemployment insurance, food stamps, and federal pensions off the table, there's only about 15% chunk left over to actually make cuts to. And cutting from just that 15% of the pie will not save enough money to really make a serious dent in the more than $1 trillion deficit. So, keep them honest, we wanted to know what specifically would Congresswoman Bachman cut now that her party controls the House. I talked to her earlier. Congresswoman Bachman, congratulations on your big victory last night. You've campaigned on cutting the deficit, cutting spending, not raising taxes like a lot of Republican, a lot of Tea Party candidates. There haven't been a lot of specifics, though, about what programs you would want to cut to really get the kind of savings that we need. Republican Paul Ryan has suggested sharp cuts in Medicare and Social Security. Are you willing to make cuts there?
What I'm suggesting is that we need to rein in the spending at all levels, and we need to take a look at all of the decisions that are being made.
In terms, though, of actually cutting the deficit and cutting spending, you're going to have to make very specific, you're going to have to come up with some specifics.
Where we need to begin, quite frankly, is with the general budget, and we saw a huge expansion. President Obama increased spending at the federal level almost 25%. That's an amazing expansion.
So you're not willing to say whether you'd cut Medicare or Social Security? You're not willing to say whether you'd entertain
what we need to do is reform the system, because this year we're spending more on Social Security than what we're taking in, 6 years ahead of the projections on when that would occur. So for the sake of the most vulnerable people in this country, we have to reform Social Security so it's solvent.
So you are willing to look at cuts in Medicare, cuts in Social Security?
Well, for cuts, we need to begin with the general budget. We need to reform Social Security so that it can stand on its own, and so that it can stand on its own with Medicare. We can't be about scaring senior citizens right now. What we need to do is lay out the facts on the table and make sure that those who are truly in need, who are vulnerable, are taken care of.
But extending the Bush tax cuts will mean, in order to offset the cost of extending the Bush tax cuts, you have to come up with $700 billion just in spending cuts alone just to offset that cost. If you acknowledge that that is true, I mean, what are 3 things you would cut immediately to help offset those costs?
Well, it's always considered a cost when people are allowed to keep their own money. I don't think that it's a cost when people get to keep their own money. Right now, the current tax policy is, in my mind, it's actually too high, the taxes right now. If we don't extend these tax cuts, for instance, in my district in Minnesota, we'll see $1.2 billion taken out of the pockets of my constituents and taken out of my local community where it will be spent. Instead, $1.2 additional dollars will be sent to Washington, D.C.,
right. But nationwide,
sucked into that hole.
But nationwide, that still accounts for $700 billion in income that the U.S. government is not going to be getting, that they're going to have to either get from somewhere else or cut spending on. I assume you want it to be from cutting spending. Can you tell me just 3 things you would do to make up for $700 billion in lost revenue for the government?
I think we need to cut the spending back to the 2000, 2008
levels. But just a specific program, 3 specific programs.
And I'm trying to answer that. I think we need to look at eligibility levels. Eligibility levels may be too high. We need to cut them down by a percentage or 2. We can solve this problem. We can cut back on the spending